You like that? That was good question.
Yeah, from some of your charts.
Yeah, that was about it. Just trying to describe Here you go.
Yeah, it's a real small gym, but real.
Did you guys do any Black Friday shopping? I was happy not to do it this year.
Very quickly.
Yeah, what is, I was gonna say, what is out there? Isn't there like a small, like, circle?
Don't balance it.
Yeah.
I mean, they got some body, I know.
I know. I saw a spot.
Yeah, I actually did.
Maybe there's somebody.
Yeah, but like your dress was there. Hey, how are you?
He's squeezing my days. He gets squeezed over there. So we got
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no.
That's a good idea. I like that. Yeah.
There's one of theirs right
no, please help.
Hey, how are you? I'm alive.
You can testify.
No, no.
I swear to God, I've almost been passing it because I'm not like teaching this.
Probably. It probably was me. I live over by the town garden.
Oh, okay.
But I go out.
Okay. Yeah. I was
Yeah, Joe and Emily live out there.
oh, okay.
Yeah, they moved west, Glendale.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Nice.
And I live in
Yeah, best story ever. Have you met Steve?
Yeah, we've been.
Okay.
Good to see you too.
Yeah, so I'm gonna be bouncing around. So yeah, loved it. Love St. Louis.
Might be seeing a lot more now.
Yeah, I know.
We've been in this world.
Can I give you a shout anytime? I'm not here for the refugee portion. I'm here for like the city and stuff.
Well, that's what we were too.
And I'm like, so I guess.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah. That's why I was wondering how many people would come to this. I was wondering how many would come to this and would stay.
I was like, I'm gonna get a feel, and then I'm like, oh. June 1st, kind of time. Yeah, I was like split my time, and then I was like, I don't need anything like tourist game or anything. Right.
Good question.
I'm like, they send it.
Sorry. Well, now they can.
Yeah, they're like same. Just like right, just. Yeah, that's like really great.
We really are, yeah. You're not gonna have a later, but
So I get a call. I'm thinking that say for
Sit tight as long as I can. But I think after I have this Medicaid passport, and then after that, I'm like, I'm taking myself up right now.
yeah. I usually try to take everything like right today.
Yeah.
So that's right. That seems like business.
No.
Oh, yeah. Oh.
But she's being like tied into all of it.
Right.
I was surprised at how many figured out. They did like a social event on that was fun, but it wasn't the same I love the Cowboys.
Thank you. Where they don't feel like they don't really fit with my so you're gonna do a regular brown.
I think they look nice. She had the England.
For me, went away and I was smoking.
Let's see. Okay. Yep. Bye. Bye. Check it out. It's all.
You can sit here if you want.
Pretty rough crowd back there. I will. I'll get in there.
Sorry, it's safe. I was just kidding.
I got the same one that you just got. I got all the very slow up the back.
Oh, yeah. I went to the house.
Yeah, oh, I still smoking.
Right.
Hands like grazes, you know, resting. That Well, no.
No.
I am.
Yeah, I know. It's not pronounced.
Yeah.
No.
What's up? I read it.
What do you do now?
Oh, I'm working
No, it's very not. I mean, they keep like that one week last week. But it's like, my dad is making everything. Amari.
Yeah.
Who's saying?
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry to break your heart like that.
Are you enjoying it?
Oh, I love it.
Are you based out of St. Louis? You moved there?
Yeah, like,
I live right next to the Potomac.
How you been?
Yeah, that's a neat neighborhood.
There's so much stuff to do, and it's great.
If you're gonna be in the city, that's kind of a nice.
Oh,
You
yeah.
never know.
Yeah,
Might be in a move this morning.
yeah, which they're Ethiopia.
Who, Todd? Or
Yeah,
Caleb?
now they're really about to get out here.
Oh, never know. Not really.
I've already seen it. I don't want to see it again.
So they took it all off and everything. So they took the gas or the burn it. Yeah, seriously. Your wife is gonna just, she's just gonna open it.
At this point, I kind of feel
Technically, we're here for the budget stuff on the but why not come to this?
I agree.
Miss out.
Yeah.
You got this. It's just such a
That's why we're sitting in the back. So I can- Yeah,
In the back by the door.
that's right. Like that.
Sure, his English is good.
Okay, let's go ahead and
Brandon
invite
was
Brian to speak.
It's like, there were two.
This joint committee hearing between the House Budget Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee. Deanna, call roll for the House Budget Committee, please.
Representative Flanigan. Fitzpatrick. Alferman. Barr. Brown. Burleson. Conway. Havener. Huff. Jones. Keeney. King. Kirkton. LaFever. Lichtenegger. Matthews. May. McCann Baby. Messenger. Monticello. Redmond. Rizzo. Ross. Rowden. Swan. Hubbard.
Here.
Allen.
Senators Schaefer, Bilby, Brown, Cunningham, Parson, Pierce, Bader, Shaw, Curls, Sheed, Walsh. That's 8 present.
Can everyone on the phone hear us okay? Three yeses and a cough. Enough. Okay. This joint committee meeting is to ascertain state services and responsibilities with regard to refugees living in the state of Missouri. We will call several departments up, and we'll call them in this order. The Department of Social Services will be first, Department of Health and Social Services second, DESE, Department of Revenue, and Department of Public Safety. So we'll start with the Department of Social Services.
Bookkeeping question, are we going to be doing public testimony today or no public testimony today?
No, we're not.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I want to thank all the members of the committee for being here, and I think it's important to keep in mind that in light of recent events, what we're looking at here is, number one, what resources are being provided to refugees, both from the federal and the state level, and what is the relationship between those two and the dollar amounts. I think number one, from a social services aspect, but also from a public safety aspect. And then on top of that, not only what services are being offered, but if there are gaps in certain areas, particularly public safety. That just went off. Particularly public safety. Are there areas that money should be appropriated to make sure that Missourians are being kept safe in light of the current situation that's going on, which is not only an issue for the state of Missouri, it's an issue nationally, but is our role as the legislative body overseeing the state budget with both these committees. It is our responsibility to make sure that resources are being used appropriately for all Missourians. So thank you for being here.
You have a question?
Yeah, I just walked in, Mr. Chairman. So we're not here to figure out how we can exclude refugees from coming in. We're basically talking about how we can, how we better understand the funding that are going to those that are already here. Is that what we're here for today? Not how we exclude those that need to come in.
Since you're a senator, I guess I'll take that question.
Please do.
I think the issue is, in light of a lot of correspondence that we're getting from constituents, particularly in light of the things that are happening internationally, Missourians want to know, Missouri taxpayers want to know what resources are being used to bring refugees to the state of Missouri, what services are they being provided for, how are they being paid for, what threat, if any, exists, and what public funds are being used to make sure that we minimize any potential risk to Missourians that may be coming into the state of Missouri. That's the purpose of this hearing.
And with that, we will start with the Director of Social Services, Brian Kincaid. What I'd like for you to do, to kind of cut to the chase here a little bit, is give us an overall view of what you do, how you do it, and how refugees show up in your system.
Certainly, Senator. I am Brian Kincaid. I'm the Director of Social Services. I passed out a presentation, and I can give you the abbreviated run through of what's in this. Our involvement with refugees in our state is pretty straightforward, I believe. The handout looks like this. Pretty basic. The process is such that when the federal government, State Department clears refugees to enter our country, those families or individuals are connected with a resettlement agency. And on the first, actually the second page of my handout, you see several organizations that are involved in this work. The starting point as refugees are entering the country are through connections through agencies called voluntary agencies. VOLOG is the term that's used to describe them. There's 9 of them, and they're listed on the second slide. Some of these organizations I'm sure you've heard of. Each of these voluntary agencies have affiliates that are spread throughout the country. There are several in our state. I've listed 5 that have operated in the state of Missouri over the last year or so. International Institute Youth Vocational Service, Catholic Charities of Central and Northern Missouri, Organization Yellow Lamb, Kansas City, and Catholic Charities of St. Louis. They are all associated with one of these voluntary agencies, and as refugees are entering the country, the connection is made between the voluntary agencies and the resettlement agencies to sponsor them, bring them to a particular location in the country. The resettlement agencies help the incoming refugee and their family establish themselves, find housing, employment, so forth. There's support that comes through a couple of different streams to support these families. One comes through the State Department, which has primary responsibility for identifying and declaring refugees that come into our country. That is very short-term support. The Department of Health and Human Services, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, offers a longer-term support through a program called Refugee Resettlement Program. And that Refugee Resettlement Program is administered in the state of Missouri by the Department of Social Services. On page 4, I begin to lay out some of the facts about this program. It is, again, a federal program. It's operated by the Department of Health and Human Services. That's the same agency that administers Medicaid and TANF and child care, so the child welfare, all of those services that primarily my department is involved with. This is one of their programs. I provided you the citations in law, and generally speaking, there's a couple of forms of assistance that come through this refugee resettlement program that is very short medical assistance for those refugees who do not otherwise qualify for Medicaid or TANF. And that's very, very short term, 8 months is the maximum on that. And then the resettlement agencies also provide self-sufficiency services. So these would be helping refugees develop soft skills, helping them with job training, job support, housing, employment, enrollment in school activities like that. Those services too generally are time limited, but can extend up to 5 years. The resettlement program, this federal program that's administered by HHS, is
Senator Sater.
Just one brief question, and I think I already know the answer, but is there any difference in the Medicaid qualifications for a refugee versus a citizen of the state of Missouri?
No. Citizens who, refugees who would apply for Medicaid and TANF have to meet the same standards that any other person.
Oh, okay.
Raise your hand.
Inquire.
Proceed.
Thank you. So for a person to be given immediate eligibility for Medicaid, come to an ER, they get treated, but there's like a period of time that they have to determine they are citizens. So these people are not going to be citizens. So is this, how long does this Medicaid go on that these people are not citizens?
The Medicaid program, all of the federal assistance programs are for citizens or for legal, lawful, permanent residents. And a refugee, by definition, is a lawful permanent resident.
At what point do they go from a refugee to an immigrant?
Or, as I understand that process, after 1 year, persons who are refugees and enter the country as a refugee, within a year, they are to apply for lawful permanent resident status, a green card. And so within that first year, they're.
And how is that monitored then that they proceed with that, they become lawful?
I would assume, I don't know, it's not our department that does that. I would assume the resettlement agencies that are working with refugees monitor that very closely with the families they work with.
So you all have no look at it?
No.
No oversight?
If a person were to come to one of our offices to apply for benefits, obviously citizenship is one thing we have to establish. And so at that point, we would have to see documentation of their legal citizenship or refugee status or legal permanent resident.
And what percentage of these get green cards?
I do not know.
So again, no oversight.
Not from my department.
Okay, one more question, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Okay, the recent welfare reform that we did last year, cutting the span of time, is this going to apply for these individuals then?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. Brian, let me ask you a quick question. So the Refugee Act of 1980 requires that DHSS have a representative who is the contact person with the federal government for administering the various programs that go out through your agency, correct?
Yes.
And that's Linda Hausa?
Linda House, yeah.
House, is that how you pronounce it? Is she here?
Yes, she is.
Okay, because we'll want to hear from her in a bit, but thank you. I just want to make sure she's here.
Did you have your hand up? Did you have a question? Donna Lichtenegger, you have a question? Proceed.
Are we not responsible for anything at that point?
Here's the question.
Yeah.
They're not filing for some sort of citizenship?
Well, at some point, if a person's status as a refugee lapses and they're no longer legal, then they no longer qualify for services through my department.
So how do we know that?
Well, there's periodic reviews of everyone who gets benefits from our agency. And so in the case of Medicaid or food stamps and things like that, there's periodic reviews of eligibility and determination of eligibility. So it's hard to one. Citizenship status, we would find out about it at that point.
So how far between, how far is the periodic? How many years is periodic?
6 months to a year. It depends on the program. Medicaid can be done every year. Food stamps can be anywhere from 6 months to, I think, slightly longer if you're disabled or elderly. The eligibility periods are longer spans between the review periods.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'll put you on the list. Okay, so.
Morning.
Good morning, Senator.
On page 2 of your handout, you have a bullet point that says the screening process takes 18 to 24 months and includes review by the United Nations Office of Homeland Security, Defense Department, and FBI. With regard to the Syrian crisis, it hasn't been 18 months. Are we going to be following that same review process, or is it being accelerated or abbreviated?
I'm not aware of it being abbreviated. If anything, I'm aware that it's been made more expensive. I'm probably not the best person to ask about.
So are Syrian refugees coming into Missouri?
We do have some Syrian refugees who've entered the country in the last year.
Okay, and
29, I believe.
okay, and so did all of these people begin this review process at least 18 to 24
We've
months?
gone through the process, probably very high level in my presentation. That's what
Is your department ensuring that this process is not abbreviated or
accelerated?
No, our department would use, as a result of that process, then the documents entered and the paperwork issued to family entering the country would be what my department uses to validate their status. We have connections to Homeland Security and the other federal agencies to ensure this.
So who would we ask to ensure that this process is not being abbreviated?
I think that's the State Department and Homeland Security.
It would have to be a federal agency.
In my opinion.
We know my concern is that the number of refugees has increased exponentially within the last few months as the Syrian crisis has developed. And I just can't hardly believe that all of these people started the process 18 months ago.
And the war in Syria, I know what I know by reading the papers, but it's been going on for some time, and people have been displaced for some time. And so I think, obviously, you've seen what happened in terms of the dislocation and many families here recently, but that's, I think, been a process or a situation that's been ongoing for some time.
Okay, you talked about this funding that comes from the federal government and that there are these different programs. Do all of these programs come through our budget, or do some of the agencies receive funding directly from the federal government without having to go through the state's budget?
I think it's both. I mentioned early when refugees are first placed, there's money that's available from the State Department that I believe flows directly to the resettlement agencies, which incidentally we were asked to extend an invitation for them to attend, and we do have representatives from 2 of the agencies here.
Would you be willing to provide us a breakdown of which of those funds and how they are delivered?
Everything that comes to the state through the refugee resettlement program, I believe, flows through our department and through an appropriation in House Bill 11.
We are currently under a budget that we passed earlier this year. Are all those funds locked up, or is there room for more refugees to come in that under that appropriation?
I'll be honest, Senator, I believe the appropriation and the funding that's available to us is very, very, very little over the last 10 or 15 years. It runs somewhere between $3.5 and $4 million. And in my time with the department, it's always kind of been at that level. I'm not expecting a big influx because of recent events.
Does the department have access to other funds that aren't specifically earmarked for refugees that you could draw from in order to put toward refugees?
Only to the extent those persons would qualify for the programs or services that would be supported with those funds. So if a refugee qualifies for food stamps or TANF, they could be served with those funds. If unfortunately there's child abuse suspected, we would do child abuse investigations. So they would engage our department, our services through the normal channel.
Okay, now you asked, or you stated earlier that these refugees, in order to qualify for Medicaid, would have to meet the normal guidelines.
Correct.
Okay, and then there's a handout here from Catholic Charities that states that all refugees arriving in the United States are entitled to 8 months of cash assistance from the date of their arrival. They vary on the size of the family from $230 up to $611 for family of 4. So is that money that they received used in the calculation of whether or not they qualify?
Well, actually, in this case, it would be because they didn't qualify. So if a family, let's say it's an adult woman, no children, that person would not qualify for TANF.
Because they don't have children.
They don't have kids.
So they wouldn't qualify for Medicaid.
Actually, you're correct. Unless they're pregnant or disabled, they wouldn't qualify for Medicaid either. In that case, then through the refugee resettlement program, 8 months of service would be provided, cash and medical, for that person.
So this seems to contradict what you said earlier, that they would have to qualify for Medicaid. Now, so if let's say a 50-year-old refugee from Syria, a male, comes in, doesn't have children, and he receives $230 a month cash assistance, he normally would not qualify for Medicaid since he doesn't have children. But you're saying that for 8 months he will qualify
Under this program, which is separate and distinct from Medicaid.
Okay, so it isn't taking state dollars. We're not having to put up the match.
For those persons, we would not put up a state match.
And so you don't call it Medicaid. What do you
It's
call
called refugee medical assistance and refugee cash assistance.
Okay, now after the 8 months, the families, after the 8 months, they don't receive that. They're eligible to apply for Medicaid. Do these amounts, say a family of four of $611, let's say there's a family of four, does the $611 exceed the normal cutoff?
I'll go back. I think I'd like to respond to the committee. I would have said that the assistance that they get through the refugee cash assistance program is the same as they would get through the CAMP program. And that frankly sounds a little higher. The federal law lays out some standards if a state issues a benefit separate from CAMP, then certain amounts have to be paid, and they are higher than what our CAMP cash program is. But what I tell you today, I think that the refugee cash assistance would be the same as our CAMP cash benefit.
Okay, will you be?
I can verify that.
In January, will you be requesting a supplement appropriation for the refugee situation?
At this point, I don't expect it.
Okay. I've got some other questions, but I'll wait until later on to ask. Thank you.
Senator Parson. Mr. Chairman, are you the lead agency that makes the decision whether refugees have been vetted or not in the state?
No.
Which one of our state agencies would be?
I'm not sure any of our state agencies would verify that they've been properly vetted.
So
to the extent we offer services and the documentation that the federal vetting process would provide, we rely on those.
So you get that
documentation. Yeah.
For example, on the Department of Defense, would you be an information system where all the information comes in on immigration or for whatever across the United States and globally, which I used to sit on that board. So do you receive that information in detail about these people?
I do not know. I don't believe so.
So you basically get a form letter, I'm assuming, saying this person has been what?
Well, we get documentation that someone's status as, in this case, a refugee.
So
they're going to pay for a federal document, like a birth certificate or a passport or something.
Okay. Because where I'm going with this whole deal is the safety of this state. So if the United Nations sends you a letter saying we properly vetted this person, here's your paperwork, Missouri. Is that good enough for us?
That's what we rely on for our purpose.
The United Nations.
Well, it's the documents issued by Homeland Security that shows that person's status as a.
So you have you would have to have a letter. So I just want to understand the policy. So you'd have to have something from the United Nations, something from Homeland Security, something from the Department of Defense and the FBI.
No, I believe, and others would know more about this than I, but I believe the result of those screenings is that the person who's been screened is issued a document that verifies the fact that they are a refugee. Okay. And once that document, like I have a Missouri birth certificate because I was born in Missouri. And we can check to see that that's a valid, properly issued document. That's what my department would rely on to do with this.
To see if they have that document?
Yes.
So you would actually verify with the refugees, you have a birth certificate?
No,
you ask for that.
We would ask for their documentation. If they are a refugee, if they were born in another country and come into this process, they will have papers issued by the federal government. And that's what, if they were coming and apply for Medicaid, for example, that's what we would need to establish.
So you basically
and pass the citizenship.
And it's not a trick question.
No,
so you basically don't know other than what the federal government tells you, whether this person's even had a look into their criminal history.
Well, we rely on those
Because-
documents being issued only if those screenings have been.
And this may be changed since I used to sit on the board, but that was when I was sheriff. You didn't have access to that information because you didn't have interpools with overseas nations at the time. The Department of Defense didn't, whether it would be Europe, whether it be these nations. So what I'm wondering, we have, I guess my point is, we have no law enforcement agencies at all in the state of Missouri checking these people out, other than what the federal government tells us.
Well, from what I know, is that the Department of Social Services is what we rely on for the services that we administer.
Okay. And I know you said you had somebody that knows more about that.
Yeah, I might refer you to
within your agency.
The refugee resettlement agencies, those agencies in the state that actually work with refugees. I are much more familiar with that process.
All right. I just want to, I think I understand what you're saying, but what you're basically saying, you receive a letter from the federal government saying this person is what?
I wouldn't call it a letter. There's a document issued, it's some federal form. I-94. I don't know what that is, other than it's a.
There's no such thing as a one-page form of the federal government, I can tell you that, but go ahead.
I would, as I understand it, I would equate it to a birth certificate or something like that. It's a document issued by an agency with the authority and responsibility to issue that under certain circumstances. And that would be issued pursuant to the screenings that are done.
And I don't mind waiting, but if somebody can answer that short, I'd like to word that comes from. Who the authority is that gives us that. Yeah, I don't know what I-94 is. I'm sure you guys work, and it'd be like a 214 DDD.
A visa.
Okay. Okay, all right, thank you.
Representative Fielder. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was looking at stuff here and I wasn't sure who said it, but I think we heard that the Syrian crisis hasn't been going on very long, and I think that the civil war has been going on for about 5 years. And so the country's been taking refugees kind of off and on since then. We also heard that the number of refugees in the state has been increasing exponentially in the last few months. Does that bear out in the actual numbers? How many refugees? We've taken in 29 this year. Have we seen an exponential growth in the last 4 months?
No, we can provide the committee, I don't think I brought it today. The past 10 years, the number of refugees entering the state has varied between 900 and about 1,500. It's been a little higher than that in the past. It was 1,400, 1,450 last year, I think.
But the influx, we haven't seen it.
I'm not aware that there has been an exponential increase.
And when we talk about
increases here, it has increased by 50 or 100, I think, each of the last couple of years. But if you look at this program in over a 20-year span, you see ebbs and flows in the numbers.
So, and maybe I'm editorializing here, and you may not be able to answer, but the threat or perceived threat that exists today would be consistent with any threat or perceived threat that we've had over, say, the last 5 years, since nothing has really changed in the number of refugees that have come to our country or to our state over the last few months.
Well, I was just saying on the last page of my presentation provides some statistics on what we've seen over the last year. If I remember last year, in federal fiscal year 15, we had 14,495 refugees entered the state. I think the year before it was somewhere around 1,400. The year before it was around 1,200.
And to help us, I think the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee talked about wanting to get at the threat that exists. And looking at those people that we serve, the numbers of people there, can you speak to the threat that exists for those folks receiving the assistance through the Department? So is there a perceived, or is there a threat there that you see for us for providing services?
Not that I know.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to point out, and I think we'll get to it when we get to the Department of Public Safety, but myself and a number of my Democratic colleagues have put forward a plan to fund the Highway Patrol and Department of Public Safety to do some of these screening things. And so I look forward in the next few hours or so to hopefully flesh out some of those plans, concrete ideas that we put forward to keep us very safe. Thank you.
Senator Rashid. Proceed.
Director, would you think it would be true to say that the United States has a very rigorous screening process?
My understanding is that the screening process for refugees is very rigorous.
Okay, and as a director, I'm sure you probably know, how do we verify? What do we do? What United Nations, FBI, Department of Defense, Homeland Security, how do they, what's the process of vetting and screening those refugees that are coming over?
I might not be the best person to ask that, but generally, as I understand it, there's a lot of matches with criminal records and other records from a variety of sources. There's face-to-face interviews on more than one occasion. Fingerprints, yes.
Do we have someone here that could actually tell us?
We probably have people here that know more about that process than I do.
And that's what I want to know. Now, I can explain some of the points if you don't.
I tell you what, let's bring you up at a separate point. Yeah, good enough.
I also
We'll bring you up at a.
Okay, so you don't know that process in terms of how we.
I know it general. I know from what I've read and what I've studied.
Okay, all right. And I heard on several occasions while I was here within the last 2 hours, the fear of refugees coming in the United States and frequent advocates. Those individuals, I think it was 1 out of 3 was actually originated from Syria. European country, correct?
Are you referring to
the Paris attack?
Paris attack, yeah, I believe a couple of.
You've been following the news, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. I
Right,
didn't know.
so it was 2 of them actually came from European countries, correct?
I believe that's correct. Yeah.
And is it true to say that approximately 38 European countries can actually come here by way of just a passport and a plane ticket?
Senator, I'm probably so. I'm not.
Probably so, I guess. That's a yes.
Okay.
So the fear, the fear of those individuals that wreak havoc in Paris, they come from European countries, right? And they can come over here by way of just a passport and a plane ticket. That's the biggest fear. That's the biggest threat. And so I think that while we're here today having a discussion about refugees, we're going down the wrong road here. If we're talking about how we're going to stop terrorist attacks in the United States of America.
I see what you're saying. Yeah,
Okay.
I would tell you that.
So, I mean, much as I want to know about, how we take care of them when they get here, I don't think that that's what this here is about. I think it's an undercurrent here that is unfortunate. But if we're going to talk about cyber attack or a terrorist attack on our homeland, then we need to begin to not look at those refugees that are coming in who's vetted in a manner in which no other country in the world vet their refugees. But begin to talk about how do we deal with those homegrown individuals that we saw a week ago, well, not even a week with Planned Parenthood, or those individuals that can come by way of 38 other European ways, right? Okay.
Are you concluded? Okay. Virginia Paper.
2 o'clock, please.
Proceed.
Thank you. I just want to respectfully disagree with my senator
representative from the city of St. Louis. I am very interested in what the cost to Missourians is for the entire refugee program. And I think we've been given a good platform to really look into this subject and find out exactly what's going on. My question for you is that my understanding that their federal policy is that agencies are to have a state plan with Social Department of Social Services, and that as part of this plan, these agencies are supposed to be reporting to the department and to the legislature on a regular basis as to where we are with refugees, numbers, expenses, and things like that. Is there a state plan that you're aware of?
The department has a state plan, yes.
With all the agencies that refer?
We have contracts with the state agencies. I'm not sure if there's a state plan that those agencies themselves file. They don't do that with my department, I don't believe. Our relationship as social services with the resettlement agency is contractual one.
Well, it's my understanding agencies are supposed to involve the state in strategies and policies with the state for the placement of refugees, and then report on these policies and strategies on a regular basis.
Okay.
Happening?
I'd have to refer to someone else to get the answer to that question.
Do you have letters of agreement with contracted agencies?
We have contracts with agencies through which the funds, but we're talking about 12.
I guess I'll save the rest of these questions for the agency.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. I'd like to answer your question. I just not quite that into it right now, and I will. If your questions don't get answered here, we'll follow up with you certainly.
Thank you.
Representative Kirkton. Proceed.
Good morning, Director. Thank you for being here. I think what I'm going to say may help clarify to you and also to the committee exactly what the Syrian refugees must go through to get here. First is a registration with the United Nations, then an interview with the United Nations, refugee status granted by the United Nations, referral for resettlement in the United States. Only the most vulnerable are referred. Then an interview with the State Department, first background check, higher level background check for some, another background check, first fingerprint screening and photo, second fingerprint screening, third fingerprint screening, and these are all screened against the FBI, Homeland Security databases, and the Defense Department. Case reviewed at the United States Immigration Headquarters. Some cases referred for additional review. Syrian applicants must undergo these 2 additional steps. Each is reviewed by a United States Citizenship and Immigration Services refugee specialist. Cases with national security indicators are given to the Homeland Security Department's fraud detection unit. Extensive in-person interview with Homeland Security. Most of the interviews with Syrians have been done in Jordan and Turkey. Homeland Security approval is required. Screening for contagious diseases. Cultural orientation class. Matched with an American resettlement agency. Multi-agency security check before leaving for the United States. And final security check at an American airport. Pretty extensive process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Marcello.
So quiet, please.
Proceed.
Good morning, Director. How are you this morning? Hope you had a good Thanksgiving. I have a few questions for you. And in addition to what Representative Kirkton said first, so Jana Mason, who is Senior Advisor for External Relations and Government Affairs with the UN High Commission, she is quoted as saying that at a minimum of 18 months before they leave. So it is reassure folks that it's not a quick response. We're not hastening any of the entrance of the refugees. These people that we keep referring to, how many of them are children? Do you have an idea? It's my understanding that about half of them are children.
Yeah, on
Consistent with what
the last page, the 42% were under 18 that came into the state of Missouri and federal district.
I emphasized these people because I think we need to remember that these are individuals that are coming from a war-torn country. They've experienced a lot of trauma and are just trying to find a safe refuge for themselves and their family. And is it correct? I think I have this information correct. For the 29 Syrian refugees we have thus far, we've received them in the St. Louis area, correct?
I believe that's correct.
Great, thank you. Have you received any concerns from the city of St. Louis, our mayor, in response to receiving these refugees? Yeah, I didn't think so because our mayor has been quite vocal in welcoming refugees because I think he understands that this is, for example, the Bosnian refugees. And I have quite a significant group of Bosnian individuals that have come to be our neighbors in my district. And what we have found is that they have created quite an economic boost for our region, and good community builders have come in and rejuvenated some of our neighborhoods. So they've been a real economic boost. So we talked a lot about this drain, our potential drain that they might be putting on our economy. Do you have any information as what the economic boost is in the long run?
No, I don't. Personally, I do know that in preparing for this morning and others, I've become aware of several studies that have been done on the economic impact and positive, not just refugees, but immigration.
And again, referring back to Ms. Mason with the UN, she indicates that the point when they become, again, in our experience with the Bosnian refugees, that they become productive members of our community within months, not years. It's some fear. It's a lot of the fears that surrounded the influx of our new Bosnian neighbors. We found that there wasn't the concern that we thought that there might be. Are you aware of any increased, and this may not be for you, maybe for public safety later, but have you been made aware of any increased police instances or concerns coming from the police, the highway patrol, or has there been abuse in regards to Medicaid applications, et cetera? Okay, thank you, Mr. Director. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Curl.
Thank you.
Proceed.
So, Mr. Chair, I believe really for us to collectively talk about the impact on the state budget, I think it's particularly relevant that the members understand the process, of course, for which the refugees are screened, are admitted to the U.S. and then to our state. Do we have someone scheduled today that can fully speak on that specific issue? I think that would probably alleviate some of the questions and also to give us a better idea of what we need to be considering collectively. If we talk us whether it happens to be social services or additional immigration services or whether it happens to be additional security. I think that, and I'm not sure who's on the schedule today, but do we have someone here that can specifically speak to those issues in the process? I think that would help us as we begin to talk about what the impact is that we need to consider.
Senator, we're going through department by department, and there are people within certain departments that are qualified to answer further and deeper questions, and we will bring those people up to that point.
Okay, so if I may,
go ahead.
With due respect, I'm wondering whether maybe some of those individuals might be the ones who come up earlier so that we can kind of ask some of these questions and then get ideas from the director's perspective of what we might have to consider if we at least understood, the process from beginning to end and what we need to be asking them, of course, as they give their testimony later. So just a thought, I think it would help me particularly ask additional questions to the director if I at least had a true understanding. I know that I understand, or I have information that, of course, they go through the screenings for the United Nations, and then they go through the screenings, of course, in the U.S. and the FBI, and that does take 18 to 24 months. And in this budget cycle, my understanding is that we would only be considering those that have been in the hopper for the last 1.5 to 2 years. But even saying, if there are other issues, and I understand that we only accept the most vulnerable, as I think Representative Monticello just said, but I think it's imperative that we all clearly understand what happens in that entire process for us to even be able to have additional questions of the director that might be relevant to the situation.
Senator Schaefer.
And Brian, I think you said that Syrian refugees pose no threat, and it's a rigorous background check.
Well, the rigorous background check.
What is it?
Syrian.
Tell me the background check.
It's, I think it was described very well by Representative Kirkman. There's numerous biometric and interviews done by.
Other than what you've read in the media, like all the rest of us, are you privy as the director of your agency to have any inside information on what that screening process is?
Not just what I read in the press and what's been given to us by the federal agency.
Okay.
We don't operate that system.
Right, so you don't have any independent knowledge whatsoever beyond what you read in the media what that process is?
Or what's been given to us by the federal agency.
Okay. Are you aware there are currently 5 Bosnian refugees in St. Louis that are charged by the United States Attorney in federal court in St. Louis with terrorist activity?
No, I'm not.
You're not aware of that? They were charged in March. Are you aware of whether or not they were provided refugee assistance to be located in St. Louis?
I do not know that.
You don't know?
No.
Okay. Are they on Medicaid?
I do not know.
Are they receiving any services that are paid for by Missourians?
I don't know.
Up until they were charged in March, were they receiving services paid for by Missourians?
I'm not aware of these persons, so I don't know if they were receiving any benefits ever.
Did they receive the same screening process as what we're discussing now with Syrian refugees?
I don't know. If they came in through this door, I'm assuming they would have.
Thank you.
But others might know more about these people with their situation.
I would certainly hope so.
Senator Shaw.
Just to follow up. Did a little search here on the internet just to track the Syrian refugee crisis. According to a timeline online, in April of 11, there were 5,000 refugees from Lebanon. That's when it started. In 2012, there were 10,000 people fleed in 24 hours. In May of 14, 1 in 5 people in Lebanon were considered a Syrian refugee. And in April of that year, they estimated that there were 1 million refugees in Lebanon. And then in June of last year, 500,000 fled Mosul in just a very short period of time. I would call that exponential. That's exponential. No, and my point about it being exponential was that the crisis is creating refugees exponentially in the world. And I noticed that in this month, in the news, it said the Obama administration is moving to increase and accelerate the number of Syrian refugees who might be admitted into the United States. And so when we read this in the news, that they are accelerating the number, and you see this increase in refugees worldwide, my question is, can you be certain as the director of the department that this 18 to 24 month process is being followed?
I trust that it is being followed.
But you don't know, you don't have any knowledge as the director that it is.
Independent of what I'm told, no, but we're told that that's being followed, and a couple of other steps being put in place with regard to the Syrian issue, and so that's what I'm.
Well, I mean, the concern that everybody has is that we just recently had an attack in Paris that was pulled off by a person who was allegedly in Europe as a refugee. And so, of course, if this process is being accelerated as we're reading it in the news, and if the process is inadequate, we might end up with terrorists being landing in Missouri, and we Missourians are concerned.
I've heard of nothing that would indicate it's going to be short-circuited.
Okay. Well, except for the media, which is saying that Obama wants to accelerate the process. So, I mean, what does that mean? Do you have any insight into what that means?
I've heard that there's a plan to increase the number of Syrians being brought into the country. I've not heard anything about it.
But when it says accelerate, does it mean
Increase the number.
Does that mean to shorten the vetting process?
What I know is that the administration has announced an increase in the number of Syrians that they intend to bring into the country through this process.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Walsh.
I apologize. I'm just because is it training program for the future senator? Director, have we determined how much of GR in the state of Missouri is used for resettlement programs?
For the resettlement programs directly, none, as I mentioned, those, a refugee that qualifies for Medicaid and.
Right. How much in matching funds? Do we have any matching funds?
For the resettlement program, no.
No, so there's no GREs?
For the resettlement program.
Okay, let me rephrase that. Is there any money used at all on refugees other than Medicaid or things that they would be qualified for as lawful residents?
Besides those, not that I'm aware.
All right, thank you.
Senator Shaw for follow-up.
Yes. Does the state enter into any contracts with the federal government to provide refugee assistance?
Yes, we have a state plan with ACF, the Department of Health and Human Services Administration of Children and Families to administer this refugee resettlement program.
So we have a state plan, which is essentially a contract with the federal government.
With regard to the use of these funds, yes.
Okay, but do we have any contracts with the refugee resettlement agencies?
Yes.
Are those contracts available?
Yes, they're public, they're competitively bid. We can provide committees both with the plan and with the copies of the contract.
Okay, that'd be good if you could do that. Next, you mentioned earlier the refugee medical assistance program.
Yes.
Does the Fed pay that 100% or does the state pay a portion?
Correct. It would be if those persons aren't otherwise eligible for Medicaid, then they do get the temporary medical assistance, and that is paid 100% federal.
Okay. Is it billed through the state?
Yeah, we deliver it the same way we do Medicaid.
So it goes through Medicaid providers?
It goes through Medicaid providers, the NMIS.
And the Medicaid providers are paid the same Medicaid rates?
Yes.
And they submit their bills to the state. So there is an administrative cost to the state.
Tiny
Administrative cost. Okay, now with regard to the 29.
Administrative cost would be paid 100% federal. Okay.
So we have, that's part of our contract with the federal government.
Yeah, and on something like this, we actually get into cost allocation plans with other agencies. There's very basic cost allocation.
Okay, but you're quite confident that the federal government pays 100%
of these special services for the refugees only, yes.
Now, with regard to the 29 refugees that were mentioned earlier, can you give us a breakdown as to how many men, women, and children?
I don't have that information at hand, but I could get it.
Can you get it? Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Representative Kirkland. Proceed.
Hey, if there seems to be some sentiment that the federal government isn't doing a good job or will accelerate the interview process and security checks, getting these people in there. If that turns out to be true, do you have any authority over that?
No, it's the Social Services Agency. We administer this one program. The responsibility for the temporary federal government.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Rashid.
So far,
Proceed.
do you know that under the international law that there's definition defining immigrant as well as migrant? Two different definitions. And when we talk about those individual screenings, the migrant screening is not as rigorous as the immigrant screening. Okay, so when we talk about those individuals who are alleged to be terrorists, the Bosnians, they could have came by way of Europe, right? They could have taken, they call them, they didn't call them refugees, they call them immigrants, okay? And so those individuals could have came by way of Europe. Those individuals could have came by way of being a migrant, which the screening process is totally different. And someone can correct me if I'm wrong. So to say that the Bosnians could play this fear factor and say that the reason that we need to be having this discussion today is because Bosnians are being accused of terrorists, when you know and I know that they could have came not by way of a refugee, okay? They could have came by way of 38 other European countries. And again, I go back to say that if we're gonna have this conversation, if we're gonna talk about refugees and the fact that they may cause harm to our country, let's talk about how those individuals that may not be refugees can cause harm to this country. Because the men, women, and children who are trying to flee from the oppression and the attacks by those that represent their country, those are not the ones we need to fear. Those children are not the ones that we need to fear, okay? And I think that we're going down a slippery slope. Do we want to be able to protect our homeland? Yes. But do we want to deny access to the most vulnerable? That's the question that needs to be answered today. Because again, we have a very, very rigorous process. And we're talking cyber attacks that hopefully we'll begin to discuss here, how we can better equip ourselves when it comes to cyber attacks. When you have individuals that are on the internet plotting and planning every single day as to how they could attack our homeland and our friends abroad. So I just want to just say that let's deal with the real issue. Let's deal with the fact that we have individuals who are fleeing oppression, who hundreds and hundreds are crossing the Mediterranean Sea trying to get away from those dictators. How can we help them? How can we let them in? Not how can we keep them out? Because that's what this country is about. It's about embracing those individuals who are trying to find and see a new way.
Senator Shea.
So Brian, on the relationship that the relief agencies have with individuals that are very, who best is qualified to talk about that relationship? Ms. House?
No, I believe it would be our resettlement agencies themselves. So we have two of them here.
And who would that be that we have here? Okay, we can bring them up. Thanks.
Would you like to come forward? No, I think he's on reserve. But don't forget to fill out a witness form, though.
Good morning.
If you would state your name and your position for the committee, please.
I'm Anna Crossland, and I'm the president and CEO of the International Institute of St. Louis.
And I'm Hillary Cohen Singer, and I'm Executive Director of Jewish Vocational Service of Kansas City.
Proceed.
Could I be allowed to provide just a short overview of the refugee program?
Absolutely.
There have been some questions about it.
We want you to.
Thank you. I'd like to just shortly say that being involved in the refugee resettlement program here since 1978 and was involved in 1980 with the founding of the Refugee Act of 1980 and the offices that are associated with refugee services here in the state of Missouri. So I have a long history and perspective on the issues of refugees, both the current arrivals as well as those that have come, starting with the Vietnamese and going through the Ethiopians and the Laotians and into the Bosnians of the 90s, and more currently then with the Bhutanese and the Somalis and now the Syrians. Let me first of all talk about the numbers, because the numbers are probably one of the most confusing aspects of refugee resettlement in the United States, but worldwide right now. If you were to look at the numbers as of June 2015 on a worldwide basis, you would find, in fact, that the numbers have increased exponentially. We now are in the worst refugee crisis since World War II, with 60 million people displaced around the world. 20 million of them are officially refugees, which mean they're escaping persecution and are outside of their countries of origin. And 40 million are called the IDPs, which are internally displaced people. So they still remain in the countries of origin, but they are not in their homes. The worst in terms of numbers right now are the Syrians and Iraqis. And the reason for that are a couple things. There is a 5-year civil war that's been going on in Syria, precipitated to a degree by a large drought that they had over there, which displaced a huge number of people internally within Syria from the very beginning, and made them vulnerable then to war and influences from the outside. Then we can get into all kinds of disagreements or agreements about Assad and the role he played in exacerbating the situation at that point. But the results are what we really want to talk about today, which is that we have 4 million Syrians and people who previously were living in Syria, half the population of Syria right now living outside of its borders, and are now officially refugees. And there are 7.6 million people who are displaced within Syria. Those numbers are scary to people, because when they hear them, they say, how the heck do we really manage to be able to cope with that kind of a situation? Well, the United Nations has what they call 3 durable solutions. And the first solution, which I'm sure all of us agree is the best, is to be able to provide temporary safe haven for the individuals in camps or in the surrounding countries to the refugee country itself, until there's enough safety that people can remain home. So it's not the intention of the United Nations to be able to resettle all of the individuals we're talking about. It's simply not possible. The second most durable solution then is to actually resettle these individuals in the countries to which they have fled. In this case, it's Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. But the situation is so massive that, as the one individual mentioned a few minutes ago, Lebanon, Jordan, they're overwhelmed right now. They can't resettle everybody that's there. But they're offering them temporary safe haven at this point in the hopes that they will be able to return if things settle in Syria. The third and least likely durable solution is what's called resettlement to a third country. And that's where the U.S. ends up playing a role, because the United Nations identifies a certain portion of the 4 million who have made application to them that are in especially vulnerable situations, and 10 nations around the world, including the United States, Australia, Canada, etc., agree then to resettle a portion of that population that's referred from the United Nations to interviewing countries. Right, Jenna Mason, who was referred to earlier from the United Nations, said in September that the United Nations had identified a subset of 130,000 individuals who they had already determined were deserved refugee status, qualified for refugee status, and who had compelling reasons why they needed third country resettlement now, as opposed to waiting through durable solutions 1 and 2. Sometimes they're families of opposition leaders and have death threats. Sometimes there are compelling medical problems that need to be addressed, as opposed to being left in the camps for long periods of time. Sometimes they're single women with small children and in especially vulnerable conditions. There are specific reasons why that 130,000 has been identified, and that's the number out of which the U.S. refugee program right now is proposing to take an additional 10,000 slots. One of the greatest confusions that occur right now at this point is that we are inundated day after day with photos, with footage of individuals who are fleeing by raft and across many countries in Europe to try to get to Germany. And we assume that that's the crowd out of which the refugee resettlement program in the United States will actually be selecting individuals for resettlement, when that's not the case. The case is that once refugees leave the country of first origin and flee to a secondary country and register with the United Nations, if they leave that secondary country, they are no longer eligible for resettlement in the United States because they are no longer present to be able to complete the interview process, including personal interviews. So they have to be in that country of secondary safety as opposed to be having crossed waters and headed somewhere else. So we are talking about a specific subset of individuals. We are talking people that it is taking 18 to 24 months to vet process. And in fact, the representative mentioned a few minutes ago, the reason it can be conducted from beginning to end is because the people are physically present for the whole process. And that it includes not only interviews by the United Nations to be able to assess the qualifications of the individual, that they are a well-founded fear of persecution. Number two, then, that they meet all the criteria of this lengthy process. And number three, that they clear the process then, including the final airport interview, which is lengthy. At one of 5 U.S. destination airports, they must clear in order to be admitted into the country, in the U.S. Once they clear that interview process at one of those 5 airport destinations, they are issued what's called an I-94, which is a visa. The visa, the I-94, gives them legal immigrant status in the United States the same way any other immigrant would have. So they are legal immigrants from day one. There is not a waiting period between that visa and having to translate it for permanent residency, U.S. citizenship. They qualify for whatever services an immigrant would be eligible for in the United States at the time they receive that I-94, which then is used at the time of registration for the Department for DFS, for RCMA, as we call it, which is refugee cash and medical assistance, etc. That document must be valid and must be present at the time of that registration to verify that the individual is who they are and that they are qualified. Are there any questions about that process?
Thank you. I just said about 50 seconds. So you actually work with the relief agencies. So whether that be Jewish Vocational Services, and I don't want you to answer this, but so you actually are with Jewish Vocational Services, but so you work with the agencies that contract with the state of Missouri to help with relocation.
We are the contractor.
You are, okay, you,
yes. Yes. There are actually 3 contractors in the state of Missouri. There's a map in your packet, and it's regional. We may have subcontractors depending on our region. The International Institute is the contractor for Region 1 and also for Region 3, which is the Springfield area.
Okay.
And then Kansas City is Jewish Vocational Services, and the central part of the state is the Diocese of Jefferson City.
Right. So those agencies, I'm assuming that all of them operate in roughly the same manner, you know?
Yes.
Okay. So, and how are those agencies funded?
In my case, we are a 96-year-old agency. We were founded in 1919 by the National Board of the YWCA, and we're part of the United Way Network in St. Louis. Refugee resettlement is a portion of what we do. We actually have 90 staff, and they're roughly $6.5 million a year in terms of total budget.
And so
we work with about 350 collaborating agencies in St. Louis, including a whole variety of law enforcement, both local and statewide and national law enforcement on our different projects.
Okay, and the funding comes from where?
From a variety of different sources, including contracts with local, state and federal government, as well as charitable contributions and fee-for-service projects.
Okay, and somebody may have more detailed questions about that. So let's say that we'll use Syrians currently as the example. How do you find out, for example, that the federal government has identified St. Louis as a location for certain individuals to come?
It actually works a little bit the other way around. I guess I stopped with the refugees entering.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to,
if
you just explain that process of, you know, do you notify the feds that you're able to take people, or do the feds notify you? And then how does that process take place?
Well, what happens is that, as Mr. Kincaid started to mention a few minutes ago, there are a number of what are called national voluntary agencies. There are 10 of them nationally, I believe it is. Some are sectarian, some are non-sectarian, and they are affiliated with a variety of local members, chapters, agencies, depending on the particular relationship between the national and the locals. These national VOLAGs are actually the contractors with the U.S. Department of State for Refugee Resettlement, which they arrange through their membership. So on an annual basis, then, once Congress approves the number of refugees to be admitted to the United States, then the U.S. Department of State contracts with those national voluntary agencies to resettle the number as specified also by area of the world through that network. And then the national voluntary works with their local affiliates and basically assigns cases depending on issues like language. Do you have the language capacity, particularly if it's a new population? Family housing situations, if they are large families, for instance, do you have the right kind of housing makeup? Availability of work that matches the kinds of needs of the new arriving families. Whether there's an existing community into which to welcome the individuals of a particular language or culture. Variety of issues like that. And then we, on a local basis, basically say, well, we think we could sponsor up to, let's say, 50, 100, 500 refugees annually.
Okay, so once you do that and you establish that parameter, then what happens? Let's say actual individuals, okay, we have five people that we want you to help us relocate to St. Louis. How does that work?
What happens is the national voluntary agencies on a weekly basis sit down with the new approved cases from overseas, and they assign those cases out to they share them among themselves, depending on where there might be the capacities that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, and also whether there might be relatives of individuals located in certain cities. Once they divvy up that caseload, then the national organization actually works with their local affiliates. And we receive notice that we might, for instance, they'll say, how about a case of 5, of fill in the blank, Bhutanese. And they may be arriving in May, they'll say. Well, sometimes it's September by the time they arrive, but you say, okay, I think we have capacity for that particular population. Then we track them basically in our database, but we only receive notice of their arrival sometimes a week or two before they actually are due to arrive.
When you say you track them in the database, you mean before they get here?
Right. Yeah. We keep in our own internal agency database. And the reason why there's such a short period of time sometimes in terms of notice that they're actually going to arrive is because they do not know overseas how long this vetting process may actually take on a case-by-case basis. Or somebody may be ready to get on the plane and they find that that they've contracted something that's chickenpox or something that's contagious. They'll hold the whole family at that point because no refugees get sent if there's any kind of contagious disease associated with them. So we don't know until fairly late whether the family will actually arrive.
Okay, so and you're with the International Institute of St. Louis.
I am.
So how many Syrian refugees are there currently in St. Louis?
29, and they're ours.
They're all yours.
We are the only. Until September 30th of 2015, there was a second resettlement sponsor in St. Louis, which was Catholic Charities Refugee Services, but they closed their office as part of a reorganization at the time. And so we are basically the last of the refugee resettlement agencies in St. Louis, although at one time there were 5 or 6 that operated.
Right. So, but there is another, is it Catholic Services that is, I think, in the process of accepting additional Syrian refugees? Do you know?
There is no other local resettlement affiliated in St. Louis that would be.
Not in St. Louis, I
No.
mean in mid-Missouri.
The Diocese of Jefferson City, which is in fact the contractor also for Mid-State.
Okay. And do you know, are they currently preparing for additional, for Syrian refugees?
You know, I think we're all preparing for Syrian refugees. How many actually arrive and in what sequence is not an issue of in our control because it's an overseas issue.
All right, let's head back to the 29 St. Louis. So, for example, what you track them because you're tracking wherever they currently are to anticipate, I'm assuming, at what point they get into the United States.
It's less about where they are and where they are in the process.
Right.
So, for instance, we may know, and sometimes, quite frankly, the cases get canceled and we don't know why. And it could be that they hit a roadblock in the security process. Not everybody that we originally expect to arrive in the community actually gets here, and that stands to reason.
Okay, so let's use, for example, the 29 Syrians and St. Louis. How do they actually get into the country? Where do they enter the country?
Most of them are actually coming through New York, through Kennedy, and that's one of the points of access. There are East Coast and West Point 5 airports through which they must, in fact, be sent in order to clear the final step in U.S. Customs, which does the interview there.
Okay, what are those 5 airports?
I don't honestly know all of them because not the person.
But you know New York?
I know New York because that's where most of our refugees arrive through.
JFK, is it LaGuardia, is it Newark?
I know it's JFK, it's Chicago, it's Los Angeles, it's San Francisco, and I think it's Atlanta also.
Okay. All right, so once they get into one of those 5 airports, what is the role of your agency at that?
There is not a role. It is still in the hands of the national GOLAG at that point. It does not actually land at Lambert Airport in St. Louis, at which point then my staff will pick them up at the airport and will have arranged for an apartment and begun the resettlement process itself to be able to give them that transitional service.
Okay, and what are those services?
Oh, gee, lots of them.
And then we don't need a great deal. I mean, I'm assuming
in general, it has to do with registering them at intake. We register them then for English language classes if it's needed. We help them with housing as we find an initial apartment. We work with furnishings and all that kind of good stuff. We register them with job placement services. We provide training in food service or sewing or alterations or nursing assistant or housekeeping if they have no skills and need to be able to have some training to be able to get into a job. We do the job search process with them, and we provide trauma and crisis counseling for some because, as you can well imagine, a certain number of cases of PTSD from the experience that they've had.
And then how long do the services that you provide last?
It varies according to the services because we also, as I mentioned earlier, are a long-term social service agency in the community. So there's a specific time in which some services are provided through the refugee process itself, the refugee contracts, and then there are other services for which they're eligible for a longer period.
Different than any other social services that your agency works with.
Right, and it would be for any immigrant,
right.
any
But
immigrant.
specifically on the refugee aspect, how long do the services that you provide last in that regard?
Contractually, the Department of State portion lasts for 90 days.
Yeah, it's my understanding that no agency provides services beyond 90 days.
Well, 90 days is the resettlement portion, and we receive a stipend from the U.S. government of $1,125 per person, with which we're supposed to provide security deposit and 3 months rent, plus food and transportation during that 90 days. And so you can figure real fast and no, it doesn't match. The numbers don't match at that point. So we do a lot of fundraising in the community actually to be able to supplement the funds to be able to provide those 90 days worth of services. In addition then to that resettlement, that core 90-day resettlement, We provide other kinds of transitional services in the community for a year or up to 5 years with state dollars. Those can include job placement services, including multiple placements, so that if somebody loses the first job, is laid off, company closes, etc., they can come back to us for multiple services. They also include English language classes, and the crisis counseling, as I said, can go on for a longer period of time as well, and health services, so that the individuals themselves are able to be healthy and to work. I can tell you, because there's a question about, you know, what they get up front versus what they get back, that the interesting thing is that regardless of, and this goes across the board in terms of our refugees that we work with in St. Louis, but across the board, in more than 85% of the families that we resettle, the cases we resettle, there's at least one working member in the family within 6 months after arrival in the United States. That's a heck of a number. And if you look, in fact, at what the return off of that is, even in state dollars, state tax dollars, you're talking for every year that we operate the program, and right now do about 500 job placements a year, that they are paying approximately $500,000 in state taxes at this point. So you take that and you look at a program for 10 years or something, at the buildup of probably 10,000 adult workers in St. Louis right now that are refugees, you find millions and millions of dollars in state taxes that are being paid right now by the refugee population we're speaking of.
Okay. And you mentioned the wave of Bosnian immigrants that came in the 1990s.
Yes.
Was your agency involved with that?
Yes, we were the lead agency for the Bosnians in 1990. We've sponsored, over a period of 8 years, we sponsored approximately 7,000 Bosnians, and the Catholics sponsored another 25,000. The community itself is as large as 50,000 today, and that's because of secondary migration, which means Bosnians that moved to St. Louis from other parts of the United States once they heard that it was an attractive place to live. Plus, we figure at least half the community right now are American-born children because the population has been here for so long. Let me also just say about the Bosnians, because there was a mention of the individuals who were arrested recently, that the Bosnians arrived in the United States between 1993 and 2001. And so they arrived prior to the screening process that we're talking about today, which was implemented in the aftermath of 9/11. So they had a much less strenuous process under which they were admitted. And it is not even clear to us how many of these individuals were admitted anyway as refugees, as opposed to coming through the normal immigrant system.
I'm glad you raised that, because isn't the issue actually with those 5 the fact that they believe they were radicalized after they came to the United States?
There is a possibility of that. It is unclear what the whole process is, and they were not well known to many in the immigrant community and the Bosnian community in St. Louis.
Right.
So I've in fact found it difficult to find people who knew them and are able to really understand or what happened with them, etc.
And then you're familiar with the Tsarnaev brothers, the Boston bomber and his brother.
Right, the Chechens
Right.
who came as children.
Who came as children and then were radicalized after they came to the United States.
Well,
my question to you is, in providing services for 90 days, because really I think on behalf of Missourians, when you look at the public safety issue that's raised by this, I think there's really 2 parts to it. And the first part is what we've been discussing here, which is what is the process? And again, you know, there is a difference between Cambodian refugees and the refugees we're talking about now, because when we talk about floods of other refugees who are fleeing some horrific circumstances, just as are Syrians, the question is you're not bringing in a population that is necessarily not going to assimilate as easily, and one that potentially comes from a region that has been defined as a terrorist region, who are trying to get members of the United States. So that's different than some of the populations I think you've dealt with before. But the issue there is 2 parts. One is the issue of the background checks, which we've been talking about, which is what is that vetting process? And that's very relevant to find out what that is. And you know, the answer of, well, the federal government does it, let's just trust them. We don't buy that. We deal on a daily basis with dollar amounts that we have to spend, with all sorts of things that we have to do, and partner with the federal government where we see negligence on behalf of the federal government. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily the circumstance here, but I think that it is right to be skeptical of what that process is. But the second part of that equation is radicalization of that portion of the population after they come here. And we've seen examples of it. I believe that is what the allegation is with the 5 Bosnians, that after they came here. So the question is, when your agency brings them in and provides them benefits for 90 days and then cuts them loose, from our perspective of spending state money, whether we're spending it or need to be spending it or what the process is, the question is, what mechanisms are going to be in place in the state of Missouri? I don't expect you to know the answer to this question. To make sure that we're not bringing in people under compassion, which I think Missourians have a tremendous amount of compassion, as evidenced by all of what you've discussed and the people that have come in to the state of Missouri since you've been with your agency. But the question is, other than that compassion of bringing them in, what happens down the road to make sure that when you have a vulnerable population for radicalization, which clearly we have as evidenced by, and I've given you 2 cases already, but I could give you a lot more, what is being done in the state of Missouri to make sure that that's not going to happen or that we're going to minimize that? And so my question to you is, as far as your agency's role in bringing in people, what is the process to stay in touch with them? To say, are you assimilating into your community? Are you happy? Are you just a face-to-face judging somebody? Are things going well? How's it going? Because it's when you find that disenfranchisement is when you find the opportunity to radicalize people.
Well, and I agree with you about several of the points that you've made already. However, there are others where I'd like to add some clarification. In my 38 years of refugee resettlement, one of the things that I have to say to you is that concerns about safety with regards to the refugee resettlement program have been there since day one. I can remember back when the Vietnamese were arriving in the 1970s, and there were a lot of concerns at the time about Viet Cong infiltrating the the refugee population at that time, and sneaking into the United States.
Did Viet Cong ever call up a terrorist attack in the United States?
Excuse me, I'm just, and later, when the 90s, well, there were actually some rather serious things that happened on the West Coast. Now, I don't know under today's modern definition of terrorism whether they are or they aren't, but that's neither here nor there. I'm talking right now about issues of history, and also in the case of the Bosnians, I saw in 1993 when Bosnians started coming through. In those years, I saw concerns at that time also about Bosnians being Muslims and that being a potential terrorist issue. Now, in the case of refugees having arrived in the United States after 1980, we're talking over 3 million individuals who have arrived here, including approximately 750,000 who've come in since 9/11. So we're talking huge numbers of individuals. And yes, there are going to be some problems here and there. And what's really great, I think, about this whole process has been, for instance, with the Bosnians, that our terrorist units in this country are safe. I knew about, we were able to find them and able to track them and apprehend them. And we at the local level work with the individuals in these different units to ensure that when there is a bad penny and they become known to us, that this kind of an activity, this kind of an undertaking happens. So yes, there are. It's about vigilance. It's also about engagement and acceptance. And
No, I agree with you. That's why I'm asking what your agency does after you basically cut off services at 90 days.
No, excuse me. What I said earlier was contractually our services lasted a certain period of time. Because we are actually an organization that has long-term services in the community, they simply transfer over at that point into our long-term base if they still need services. And we, because of the many activities we undertake in the community with our various immigrant communities and our refugee communities, in fact, stay in touch with these families for decades, if not more. In St. Louis, it is frequent that I run into people when I make public presentations, etc., who say, "Oh, I know you, my parents went there, they stay engaged in the community. We know of them and they know of us." And so if they have an issue, they come back to us, and we stay in contact with them as well. But I want to look.
So what happened with the 5 Bosnians?
They were secondary migrants, first of all. They were not sponsored to St. Louis, and so we did not come into contact with them from the beginning. One of the issues about the refugee program that we need to understand, and it goes back to the very core of who we are as Americans, is that we have freedom of movement. When we have legal status in this country, we can live wherever we want at that point. We don't want that taken away from us. Well, it means that the refugees can move around too, and they sometimes move from city to city. And when they move to a new city, then the organizations that are there don't necessarily know who they are or what is happening with them unless they become known to them in one particular way or another. It does not mean that most of them are in fact problems even. It just means that they have freedom of movement. In this case, these individuals are not people who are sponsored by us. We simply never knew of them.
I mean, that's a very good point. So a family, for example, or an individual that gets located to St. Louis, what does your agency do? Let's say that after your 90 days runs out and they just move somewhere else. Do you follow them?
If they leave a forwarding address, then we in fact write the forwarding state to let them know that they're coming.
What do they know?
Do we always leave forwarding addresses when we move?
No,
I mean,
no, but I think that's
one of
the whole
issues.
point.
But I'm saying that once they are admitted here, they have the same opportunities as any other immigrant. And so that's an issue. If you don't like that system, then that's something you have to look at for all of us, not just for a particular targeted population. And then, you know, going back to this issue of safety and security, because I know it's a really important one. It's an important one to me too. I have children. But, you know, the refugee resettlement program is not just about humanitarianism. It is a very important aspect of what the refugee resettlement program is. But it's also about two other things. And those, a second one that was alluded to a little bit in my remarks and also in Mr. Hitchcock's remarks, which have, Kincaid's remarks, which has to do with economic development, which is, quite frankly, for St. Louis and for Missouri, a really big issue. You know, we're suffering from depopulation. We're suffering from a lot of economic woes in the state. Our birth rate is low. For us to attract new people to Missouri right now, the primary target are immigrants. And immigrants can choose to go lots of places. Refugees that we sponsor come here because they have an offer of assistance and invitation, and therefore are in fact more excited about living in Missouri sometimes than that corporate transfer is. Immigrants in St. Louis, there was a study done in 2012 by a gentleman by the name of Jack Strauss, who's an economist at St. Louis University. And what he found were immigrants across the board, regardless of their level of education, that they were 60% more likely to start a small business than a native-born American. It's the backbone of our economy as a city and a state to figure out how to be welcoming to immigrants, not to be discouraging to immigrants. Which then leads me into my third reason why refugee resettlement is important for this country, and it goes to foreign policy and it goes to safety. Yes, we're concerned about safety of ourselves here, even though at this point it appears that there were terrorists associated with the French attack that in fact were refugees themselves. And even though France, in the face of the attack, has said that they will still honor their commitment to resettle 30,000 refugees. But the two things that we have to look at as a nation, really in terms of safety, are number one, our impression in the world, and to the Muslims, we say no Muslims, we don't like Muslims, we don't want Muslims. Does that in fact offer opportunities for the radicalized people because they fear they're being hated anyway, both here and elsewhere? And if there are parts of the government now that are talking about it already, really want to put boots on the ground in Syria, how do we do that in a nation that, number one, fears working with us because we're anti-Muslim to the point where we won't even take 10,000 vulnerable women and children, and number two, where, I'm sorry, I just lost the train of thought. Anyway, I was sort of at the end of that one. Oh, and where we know afterward, if we're going to pull out of there, we may not even take the people we've worked with us. So we need to think about those issues in the context of this larger discussion. So let me stop at that point. I know you've got other things to talk about.
Representative King.
Thank you very, very much for your very concise and clear description of the the vetting process and so on and so forth, and the process that you're involved with. You've really already answered most of my questions, but let me just touch on a couple of things. The refugee assistance program that the state is involved with, for receiving federal funds and creating them to cover these costs, lasts for 5 years. And the hope is at the end of that 5 years, people will be citizens and contributing members. We've already mentioned that within 6 months, 85% of these families that working, at least one working member in the community.
Yes.
And to also kind of bring in what Representative Monticello talked about earlier, that these people seem that they're here, they realize the blessing that being able to come here to this country is, and they're ready to go to work, and they're working hard and contributing based on some of the other things that you mentioned. And I was particularly pleased when you mentioned that if people pull out of the secondary country that they're in when they start the resettlement process, that they actually lose the opportunity to be considered for coming to come here, and that was I thought very, very helpful. The I-94 visa, basically, that's a permanent status. Is that?
It must be converted after 1 year to permanent resident status.
It's converted to.
They have to apply residency after 1 year. It, years ago, used to be. I think it's still referred to, in fact, as a green card, even though it hasn't been green in probably 30 years. But it is a green card status. Once they obtain the green card status, then they have an opportunity within 5 years after arrival to apply for U.S. citizenship. But they also have the opportunity to remain on green card status until whatever time they apply for U.S. citizenship. There are a variety of reasons why an individual might, in fact, not apply for U.S. citizenship at the 5 year point. One of the largest is a money issue. It can cost about $1,000 per person between the application and the medical certification and costs associated with making the application. Then there is a lengthy citizenship test that they have to pass, that we all know about, the 100 questions that something like 70% of Americans couldn't pass if asked them these days. Depending on how many jobs they're working, because many of these people are working 2 jobs, one to make money to spend to survive here, and the second to send home to relatives overseas. They just may not have the time to be able to do it right at 5 years. So they can remain a permanent resident until the time that they apply.
Okay. And talk to me about at the end of 5 years, the one concern I had was how many of these families then at the end of the 5 year period convert into welfare, if any?
Virtually only anybody who might have been eligible already for TANF and be within the process. They have the RCMA for 8 months after they arrive if they're not eligible. TANF rules, except for they have to meet the same rules anybody else would within the state. So there's time limitation rules. There are participation rules. Have to meet all of those, and I would assume it's unlikely they would be enrolled at 5 years at that point.
So in your opinion then, at the end of 5 years, we're not adding a lot of burden to the state of Missouri
No.
as far as costs coming directly from general revenue.
Particularly when you look at the amount of the amount of contribution to general revenue that the refugees are making through payroll taxes.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Girls.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, John Clark. So, I guess when I asked 9/11, but also specific to these that you guys have received, about what percentage of those would you say are women and children? And what percent would you say would be maybe males 18 and
It's
30?
hard to generalize with only 28 people at this point. What I can tell you is that more than 50% of the applicants in the pool of 130,000 are women and children. I can also tell you, the 2,000 Syrians that have already been admitted to the United States. See, this is the other thing that's confusing, I think, because there are Syrians coming right now. Well, no, there are Syrians that are coming right now, and they're not part of this extra 10,000.
Right.
What has happened is this last year, normally there's a refugee resettlement program that operates in the United States, and of the numbers allocated to that, to the normal program, 1,500 numbers were set aside last year, and a few Syrians to the United States that had already become known and were a modest attempt at being able to break away at some of the numbers that the United Nations had available. So refugees from Syria have been coming already to the United States. In total, about 2,000 of them have been admitted to the United States already, of which 29 are now here in St. Louis. So that's the way those numbers fit together. Only of that 2,000, over 50%, well over 50%, the majority of them are women and children. And in fact, less than 2% of that total number of 2,000 that have been that have arrived already are single males within what would be considered combat age. So the fear that some people have, because they see these large groups of people moving into Europe at this point, with the face of young males is sort of dominating. The reality is that the U.S. refugee program itself doesn't look like that. The males that are coming are part of family units, and they are primarily, in fact, small children. Yeah.
And if I could add to that, of the about 1,700 refugees that were admitted into the United States last year, the specific figure is 67% of those were women and children under age 12. And of the Syrians that are awaiting in camps in Lebanon and Jordan, over half of those are children, and 75% of those individuals are under the age of.
So let me ask this also. So of the Syrians, I'm using them because that's part of the discussion we're having today. Of the Syrians that you guys service, that may not come over as refugees, but immigrants, say from other countries, because as Senator Nasheed said earlier, it is a lot easier for potential terrorists to come to the U.S. from other European countries. Of those that you guys service, refugees that happen to be immigrants, what percentage of those folks would you say happen to be young males or combat age? And I'm not sure whether that's 18 or 30 or what they consider combat age.
Let me go back and clarify the bigger picture of immigration now, because that might help contextually there. All refugees are immigrants with a capital I, but not all immigrants are refugees. Refugees are a subset of a larger group of individuals that are admitted to the United States on an annual basis with immigrant status. They are approximately 10% of the total number of admissions, 70,000 a year or 700,000. The bulk of the individuals who are admitted as immigrants, but not as refugees, fall into two categories. Family reunification, which means they're coming over here because they have a close family member who's already here and has petitioned to be reunified with those individuals, or because of labor certification, which means they're coming to work for an American corporation. You may sometimes hear it referred to as an H-1B category visa. So those are the bulk of the individuals who are being admitted through the regular immigrant path. Because there are actually only a limited number of Syrians already in the United States, and they are generally not in the St. Louis or Missouri area. So the number of Syrians that are actually arriving over here with immigrant status to the state of Missouri is very, very small. They are far more likely to be in Los Angeles or Pennsylvania or Michigan at this point, which are the large Arab communities around the United States. The other Syrians that we talk about who come over here come through a temporary visa, if we want to call it that, a time-limited visa. They may be tourist visas, foreign student visas, guest worker visas, although that doesn't really apply to people in Europe. That's a category that's set up primarily for Mexico, etc. And individuals that fall into those categories, by and large, aren't people who are recipients of services at the International Institute, because we're really focused on providing services to people who have come over here permanently to be a part of the community. Foreign students would be addressed through their foreign student offices at their universities, for instance. Tourists, I'm not sure where they get addressed in the large scope of things, but really in terms of Syrians in St. Louis now who did not come there through the refugee path, you find some who converted from foreign student status to immigrant status because of a work authorization, generally an H-1B. And you find a few here or there who have family, and that's about it.
So I want to say this too. When we talk about the issue of public safety, I agree with the appropriations chair in that we can't just rely on the federal government in dealing with our public safety issues here in Missouri and minimizing any threat, of course, to Missourians. And for those on the committee that do not know, Kansas City International Airport is one of the top travel hubs in the country for known or suspected terrorists. Fourth in the country. So when we talk about the issue of public safety, it's one thing that we're also having this discussion about the Syrian refugees or others, but we also need to talk about a larger issue we have here in Missouri, specifically in Kansas City with our international airport. And I did just ask an airport police about this a few weeks ago, in that there are always, apparently, federal marshals there questioning folks that are getting off those planes. So when we talk about public safety, let's talk about that issue as well. We want to talk about the risk factor here for Missourians. And my question also becomes, if you guys were to serve immigrants that of course come here, are you guys at all notified by the federal government of those that may be known as suspected terrorists?
So I would answer that our agency would not serve anybody who is a known or suspected terrorist, because they would not be granted entry into the United States under the refugee admissions.
No. Okay, not just relative to refugees. So here's what I'm saying. So apparently at KCI Airport, they obviously know who these individuals are, because as soon as they get off the plane, many times you'll see federal marshals, at least grabbing them, and I know that other times there are undercover federal marshals that happen to be maybe following some of the folks that happen to be known or suspected on the list. My question becomes, and it goes back to whether we as Missourians want to only rely on the federal government for our safety. I understand that you guys would not necessarily serve them if you had known that they happened to be on the list or on the watch list. But are you guys notified of those who may come to your agency that may be passing through, because you're from Kansas City, is that correct?
Yes. So our agency works slightly differently than International Institute. We're not quite as large an agency. And so our programs are limited to two types of individuals. One is refugees who are formally admitted through the U.S. refugee program, and the other is individuals with disabilities who are referred to us through vocational rehabilitation. So unless you meet one of those two criteria, we don't have services that are available to the general public. So I would imagine that individuals that you're speaking of would not be eligible for services through us.
Right. So I guess my question then happens to be, for you, for those folks that happen to get off the plane, either in Kansas City or St. Louis, as I said, we are one of the top travel hubs for those that are known suspected.
Well, and I have to respond that from the St. Louis standpoint, our airport is probably one of the lower transportation hubs for internationals in general, because I believe we only have one international flight a week from London. And so the number of people who are passing through St. Louis and getting off the plane in St. Louis are from international destinations is we are not, we work the other way around, where we regularly consult provide introductions for law enforcement in various ethnic communities, etc., so that they can build relationships with people who will in fact know individuals who might not in fact be people that we know at the same time. And so we work with the feds, but the feds don't, for a variety of reasons, provide us with the information about somebody who may be on their list, because quite frankly, they are less likely to in fact come and register for a program like ours. They're probably going to more likely want to stay under the radar screen.
If I could just add, in Kansas City as well, we work really closely with our law enforcement, with police, and with the FBI and with Homeland Security, and there have been a number of instances in the past where we have communicated with law enforcement about particular individuals, either because we have a concern or because law enforcement has a concern. It is the utmost priority that do safety and security practices, and that we make sure that anybody that we have a suspicion about, or that law enforcement has a suspicion about, that gets taken care of.
Yes, and my question is not whether you all, having known that, would, attempt to be as proactive as you could, and, trying to make sure that, of course, everyone remains safe. But as we're having a larger issue of public safety, and obviously I think you guys have communicated, I hope some of us better understand probably that they are a much lower risk than, say, folks who may immigrate from other European country coming from other suspected terrorist countries as well. I mean, I think if we want to talk about public safety, then that's part of the discussion we need to be having, is not necessarily just refugees, but those that happen to be coming through other countries that we know are known or suspected terrorists that have come with just a passport to the United States, and with Kansas City International Airport being one of the top travel hubs for some of those.
Can you ladies join us after lunch for further questioning from Representative Haefner, and we'll be back at 1 o'clock.